Hey everyone, welcome back to my YouTube channel. My name is Erica and I'm a traditional media artist that enjoys pushing herself with a variety of different drawing and painting mediums, as well as with a variety of different subjects. And today I'm going to be sharing a fall-inspired watercolor tutorial. We're going to be practicing the wet on wet technique, the wet on dry technique, layering, and really creating a sense of depth. In the description box beneath this video, I am linking to a post over on my Patreon that I have left free and open for everyone to enjoy. If you scroll down to the end of the post, you're going to be able to find the attachments or downloadables that I have made available along with this tutorial. One of those is my outline drawing. You can go ahead and download it and transfer it onto your watercolor paper and go ahead and get started with the painting process. With all that said, let's jump in. Time to get started with preparing our first few color mixtures that we're going to be using for our background. I'm going to be using my size 5 round brush to prepare these first few color mixtures, and it's always super important to prepare those bristles of your paintbrushes before actually using them in your paint, before going into your paint with them. So make sure that you swivel your paintbrush in your container of water to moisten and dampen those bristles before using them in your paint, whether you like using pens or tubes, it doesn't matter. Prepare the bristles of your paintbrush, and what I am doing right here is I am taking out a bit of that Indian yellow at a time by swiveling my damp paintbrush, dropping in a bit of water into that pan, swiveling my paintbrush in there and bringing out a bit of paint at a time into the well, and then doing that on and on until I have a good amount of paint in there and I've arrived at a nice and juicy color mixture. Once my yellow was ready, I removed all of the yellow from my paintbrush bristles and I did the exact same process but now with my permanent red light. After this, I'm going to create a orange by mixing together a bit of the two colors. So this third little puddle of color is a mix of Indian yellow plus permanent red light. And after I'm done with this orange, I'm going to remove all of this orange from my paintbrush bristles once again by swiveling my paintbrush in my container of water, removing the excess water by gently scraping the bristles of my paintbrush along the top of my container there. And I'm going to do the exact same thing with my burnt sienna. So I'm going to prepare one last mix of burnt sienna with a bit of water in it on this last well here. And then we're going to be all set to paint our background. You want your color mixtures to have approximately 50% water, 50% paint in them. That's what I mean when I say nice and juicy. You want some amount of water in them, but a good amount of color pigmentation in them as well. And that is super important. I oftentimes see beginners add way too much water to their color mixtures, or along the way, they become very watery and they don't add more color into them along the way. You have to remember that every single time you go into your container of water, even if you remove the excess water from your bristles, you're bringing in at least a tiny bit of water into your color mixtures, and this is going to start watering them down along the way. So you have to keep an eye on your mixtures and make sure that they have the level of pigmentation that you need for that point in time in your painting process. Because we're going to be doing pre-wetting with clean water in this background, before dropping in our color, it's very important that your color mixtures are well pigmented, because there's already going to be a certain amount of water content on your paper that is going to be added to the water in your mixes. And when we drop in our color onto paper that has been pre-wetted, it's automatically going to diffuse out into that wetness. Okay, and your color is bound to look lighter already because there is water on there, and watercolor is always going to expand and dissipate into paper that is wet. And so just make sure that those color mixtures are nice and pigmented. All right, so my initial color mixtures are ready to go. I am going to change my water because this is very orange. And as I said, I'm gonna be doing pre-wetting and I want this water to be clean. All right, so I've changed my water. It's nice and clean now. And I'm going to be using my 1-inch flat brush to do my pre-wetting. I'm going to be bringing out a bit of water at a time from my container, and I'm going to be using a mixture of horizontal brush strokes at first, and then I'm going to move on to using vertical brush strokes. Make sure that you take your time with this pre-wetting process. Don't rush it. Make sure that you arrive at a nice even sheen and that there are no puddles anywhere. If you do see a puddle, just remove that water from your paintbrush bristles, tap your bristles of your paintbrush on your absorbent towel, and run those bristles over that section where you see that excess water, and that should smooth things out, remove that excess water. Remember that the bristles of your paintbrush can be used as a little absorbent sponge as long as you don't have too much water in them. They can pick up that excess water for you. And just continue doing those horizontal and vertical strokes until you arrive at a nice even sheen. Be nice and gentle as you're doing this because you don't want to affect or remove the sizing of your watercolor paper in any way. I probably go over everything 3 to 4 times, and it's very, very important that no specific section of your paper starts drying way too fast. You should be able to allow that water to just settle on your paper for 10 to 15 seconds without any section starting to dry. And if a section starts to dry, then it probably means you haven't pre-wetted enough. Now, it's really going to vary a warm and dry environment, or a warm and humid environment, or a cold and dry environment, or a cold and humid environment, whether you have a heating system on or a fan on, or anything like that. It's really going to affect how quickly your paper starts to dry along the painting process. And it's just very, very important that you're aware that all of these different variables really come into play and affect both the process as well as can affect the final outcome when painting with watercolor. It's not only the type of paper, the type of paint, the quality of your paper, the quality of your paint, but it's also the environment that you're working in that may make your process look a little bit different from mine. But as long as you're aware of it and you keep practicing, you're going to build up these tools that you can have up your sleeve so that you can make decisions quickly along the way and arrive at the results that you're looking for. And of course, as you continue practicing with watercolor, the more confidence you gain and the quicker you're able to work. And this, when it comes to painting with watercolor, is huge, because you often arrive at better, looser, fresher results when you're able to work faster. Okay, so after having done my pre-wetting effectively and seeing a nice even sheen all throughout my page, I switched on over to my mop brush. And I started by very randomly dropping in my yellow, which is the lightest color of the bunch that I prepared for this area. Initially, I always go in from the lightest color that I've prepared and I make my way towards the darker color. And then if after having gone through this process, I want to go back to a certain color, then I do that. But I always go from lightest towards the darkest. You can see how I am jumping around the page. I'm keeping everything very irregular, very loose. And I want to leave certain sections in which that whiteness of the paper is shining through completely unpainted. And as you can see, because I am dropping in my color on paper that has been pre-wetted, that color is diffusing out and I am left with nice blurred out soft edges. That water is helping those colors merge organically into each other and create these beautiful effects. Right here, I have decided that I've placed a good amount of color on my paper. I remove the color from my paintbrush bristles, I remove the excess water, and I'm going in with just a teeny tiny amount of water in my paintbrush bristles, almost no water at all. You don't want to go in with too much water on paper that is wet because you can start creating backgrounds. But essentially, I remove the color from my paintbrush bristles and I go back in with barely no water at all, and just in certain sections where I want to maybe merge those colors together a little bit better, or I want to pull a bit of that color out a little bit more, etc., but just very minimally. And then if I want to drop in just a bit of any of my colors, I go ahead and do that. Now, another reason why I love pre-wetting and wet on wet, especially with these first washes of color, is not just because of the beautiful effects that wet on wet allows, but also because it gives me more working time. Because what you have to remember is that when you start placing paint on paper that is dry, that paper starts absorbing that paint immediately when it's placed on your paper. There's more of a chance that you're going to be left with sharp defined edges around your shapes that you're painting in, and you can probably start seeing how this can be a bad thing when you're trying to paint large washes of color like this background right here. So this is why oftentimes when I'm painting in larger areas or larger shapes like this background, I oftentimes like doing pre-wetting with clean water before starting to drop in my color, because I know that this water content that I've already placed on my paper is gonna do half of the work for me, and there's much less of a chance that I'm gonna be left with hard edges around the shapes that I'm painting in and undesired textures that I'm gonna feel the need to go in and fix, and that is only going to lead to more textures and more splotchiness. You're gonna have more working time because that paint is gonna dry a lot more slowly, so you can gently move your color around a tiny bit, get rid of any textures that you don't want, or merge colors together while that paint still has a good level of wetness, or even drop in a little bit more color or whatever it is that you need to do before that paint starts to dry on you. Okay, so I'm almost done here. As you can see, I still left some amount of paper shining through some sections, and this is important because this is going to help me create a nice glowy light look. When we're painting with watercolor, it's important to incorporate that lightness and that beauty of that paper in some shape, way, or form into our painting. Oftentimes, it's keeping those whites protected for our highlights, but other times, like for this looser piece, I am integrating that paper as part of the background and creating a nice light effect. When you don't do this and you cover up the entire paper with paint, oftentimes that's going to lead to a flat, heavy look. All right, so I finished up with the background. I allowed everything to dry completely. Feel free to help yourself with a hair dryer to speed up the drying process, but make sure that everything is 100% completely bone dry before moving on to the next part of the painting process. Now you can probably tell that that color in my background looks a little bit lighter than how it looked when it was wet. Watercolor almost always looks lighter when it dries versus how it looks when you first place that paint on the paper. And this has nothing to do with the quality of your paint necessarily or the quality of your paper. It's just kind of a characteristic for this medium. All right, so what I am doing right here is preparing my next color mixtures that I'm gonna be using for this next part of the painting process. We're gonna get started with painting the leaves, and now we're gonna be painting on dry paper. We're gonna be bringing out the violet and the Van Dyke brown, or whichever dark brown it is that you chose. So for the leaves, I have to make sure that I have enough of all of my previous color mixtures that I created in the beginning of the painting process, because we're going to be using all of those as well. So if any of those ran out for you, just create a little bit more and make sure that they are nice and juicy. Perhaps you just had a little bit of one color left and it dried on you and you have to make a little bit more. Just make sure that you have a puddle of yellow, a puddle of red, a puddle of orange, right? By combining the yellow and your red. And you also need a puddle of burnt sienna. And then aside from that, what I just prepared for myself is a mixture of burnt sienna plus permanent blue violet. These are the colors that you see right here swatched out at the very bottom of this strip on the right. It's a very dark, rich, brownish, purplish color. And finally, the last mixture that I created for myself is a mix of Van Dyke brown, or whatever darker brown it is that you chose, and my burnt sienna. Burnt sienna is kind of a medium reddish brown, and I wanted to darken it a little bit more, so I added a little bit of my Van Dyke brown to it, which is a very dark brown. You can play around with the ratios of burnt sienna and whatever darker brown it is that you chose. until you arrive at a dark brown that you like. You can see a couple of different versions, and this is just the two colors mixed together at different ratios. The top one has more of the Van Dyke brown in it than the burnt sienna, and the bottom has more of the burnt sienna than the Van Dyke brown. I wanted to create this brown for my leaves, for those sections of leaves that I wanted to make look very dry and kind of crispy. But I do want to make sure that my leaves are overall very nice and colorful. And so I would recommend dropping in just a small amount of this darkest color, this darker brown that you prepare for yourself. Okay, so with my color mixtures ready, I prepare myself by having on hand both my size 5 round brush and my size 2 round brush. I highly recommend having both on hand as you're moving forward with this so that you can switch between them quickly. You're gonna paint in the leaf initially with the larger brush, and then you're gonna switch quickly to the smaller brush so that you can create kind of irregular edges. And you have to do this while that paint is still wet, because otherwise you're not gonna be able to pull that color slightly out and create those irregular edges with that wet paint. Okay, so this is me going in with my size 5 round brush, and I'm getting started with the first layer of paint in this first leaf. So as you can see, I'm going in with a pretty translucent version of my orange. This means that my orange color mixture has a good amount of water in it. The more water you add into your color mixtures, the more translucent and the lighter that color will be. I'm always going to start with a light color first, whether it's the yellow or the orange that I prepared for myself. I make sure to run the bristles of my paintbrush over the entire shape a couple of times, and then I drop in the next color that I choose for this leaf. And I make my way from lighter colors towards darker colors. If you don't take time with that initial layer of your most lightest color that you're gonna be using for that leaf, and you don't run the bristles of your paintbrush a couple of times through that entire shape, most likely than not, it's gonna start drying very fast. And by the time that you wanna place your second or your third color on top of that, that first layer is gonna be dry, and you're not gonna be able to create these wet on wet diffused out effects, right? For each leaf, I am going to be using different combinations of my colors that I've already prepared for myself. I want to encourage you to play around with your color mixtures. They're all going to look nice together when they're merging together, especially because this color scheme that we're using is composed out of analogous colors, meaning colors that are next to each other in the color wheel, which are always going to have nice transitions between them. And of course, we have a couple of browns, which are neutrals. But I'd recommend starting with one of the lighter colors, so either the yellow or the orange, and then start placing the others on top. And once you're happy with the variety of colors and values that you've developed throughout that leaf, go ahead and switch on over to your smallest brush and do a little bit of slight and gentle pulling out along the edges of your leaves so that you can create a little bit of irregularity throughout those edges instead of having them be perfectly smooth and curved. And again, you have to do this while that paint is still wet so that you can actually move a little tiny bit of that color out to create those softer, subtle, little irregular curves throughout that edge. Okay, so I finished up with that very first leaf. You can see a little bit of yellow in it. You can see some reddish brown in it. So that's primarily the burnt sienna. And I also want you to notice how I left a little sliver of paper unpainted with this new layer of paint that I created for the leaf. I left something that looks like a highlight almost, in which that bottom underneath background paint color is shining through. And these are little sections of paper that you're gonna see me leave almost in every leaf that I paint in, but they happen naturally as I am moving my paintbrush, and I just leave them so that they can just be a little highlight in each leaf. I'm just finishing up with the second leaf here. You can see how this one is way more red than the first one, which is cool because I want that variety, not only within each leaf, but also in all of my leaves as a whole. I want them to look different from each other. Right here, I noticed that the first leaf is still wet enough that I can darken certain sections, so I drop in a little bit of my darkest brown, which is my Van Dyke brown plus a little bit of burnt sienna. I'd recommend using anywhere from 2 different colors to 4 different colors in each leaf, and really play around with your color combinations. And just remember the main thing here. Get started with the lightest color and make your way towards the darkest color. And make sure that you switch to your smaller brush while that paint is still wet to do some gentle pulling to create a little bit of an irregular edge. I am making sure to completely rinse out my previous color from my paintbrush bristles before going into a new color so that I don't contaminate my different colors on my color mixing palette. This is going to help my colors stay nice and bright for my leaves. And I want to be especially mindful whenever it is that I have some of my neutrals, so some of my browns in my bristles of my paintbrush. Because when analogous colors get added to each other, so let's just say a yellow gets mixed into a red, or an orange gets mixed with the red, or even purple gets mixed with red, because those colors are analogous, so next to each other in the color wheel, the mix is still going to be very bright and vibrant. However, when you accidentally add in a little bit of that brown into your color mixtures, that is going to start muting that color out and making it look less bright. So especially when you just worked with one of your neutrals, especially the darker brown, you want to be careful and make sure that you rinse out all of that color before jumping into one of the brighter colors. For this particular leaf that I am working on right now, I started off with the yellow. I then dropped in some of my orange, and I am now going to go into my purplish brown color, dropping it into certain sections, and then to finish up, I'm going to drop in my darker brown. That is my mixture of burnt sienna plus Van Dyke brown. Once I finish with this leaf, I decide to experiment what it would be like to jump straight in with my red as my first color. However, I make sure that my color mixture is nice and watered down and that I only grab a little bit of color from the top or the left side of that well on my color mixing palette. This color mixing palette has slopes in those wells, which can be very handy because when you just want to take a small amount of paint, you can take that paint from the upper part of that well. And because you are taking that paint from the upper part that is higher above and most of the paint is falling down into the bottom of the slope, right, because of gravity, that is going to help you grab a smaller amount of paint. So I decide to jump straight in with the red as my first color, but I do make sure that it is, again, nice and watery and that I only take a small amount of color to get started. Now, when I started painting in that first red brushstroke, I noticed that the color was still a little bit too saturated and too dark for that initial layer that I want to make sure is the lightest. So I want to show you how I fix that. I am going to replay that part of the video for you so that you can know what to do whenever this happens to you. Here we go. I'm going to show you this in slow motion. After having painted in that stroke, what I did after noticing that it was too dark and saturated for that first layer was I immediately removed that color from my paintbrush bristles and I went back in with just a bit of water in my paintbrush, and while that paint was still wet, that little saturated red brush stroke, I actually moved that color and expanded it out to cover the entirety of that leaf. And so that made that red look a lot lighter because you extended that color while it was still wet and distributed that same amount of color amongst a wider, larger area. So if you ever find that happening to you, if you ever go in with too much paint or your color is way too saturated, just stop what you're doing, remove the color from your paintbrush bristles, remove the excess water, and go in with just a bit of water in your paintbrush and smooth that color out, expand that color, pull that color to cover up a larger area. That is going to soften that color and make it look a lot lighter. It's all about staying focused in the process. Notice how much color and how much water you're placing on your paper. Constantly have an eye on that And then if you need to modify anything, move quickly while that paint is still wet. Either do some lifting with the clean and only slightly damp bristles of your paintbrush. Use those bristles as a little absorbent sponge. Go in with your absorbent towel, or remove that color from your paintbrush bristles and go back in and move that color while it's still wet. If you stay focused during the painting process and you make sure that you're starting from lightest and making your way incrementally towards your darker colors, and you're always keeping that idea of developing a wide range of values and translucencies in mind, if you ever make a little mistake, as long as you move quickly while that paint is still wet, you can fix a lot of those little mistakes. Hopefully you've taken notice of how I am constantly helping myself with my absorbent towel to stay on top of water control. So whenever I feel I have way too much water in my paintbrush bristles, I actually tap or dab the tip of my paintbrush bristles on my absorbent towel that I have right here on my left. And I then go into my painting. And this is very important because these are relatively small shapes that we're painting. And if we go in with way too much paint or water, or both, then we can start very easily losing control. And we have to maintain a certain level of control, because if we want to develop a variety of hues and values in each leaf, and we drop in way too much color, then that color can easily expand and overtake the entire leaf, right? And so water control is super, super important when you're painting in smaller shapes. And when it comes to developing your water control, which is an essential skill for painting with watercolor, it all comes down to paying attention and constantly shifting and changing, or patiently waiting for certain sections to dry if needed. But it's paying attention to how much water 3 different things have throughout your watercolor painting process. And those 3 things are, number 1, the bristles of your paintbrush. How much water/paint is in your paintbrush bristles. Number 2, how wet is your paper? How much water/paint is on your paper already that you might have to allow to dry before you work on the next layer, right? Or you may have to pay close attention so that it's still wet by the time that you drop in that next color, depending on what it is that you're doing. You may have to work quickly so that you can work with that wetness, or you may have to allow it to dry. And number 3, how watery are your color mixtures on your color mixing palette? And as I said, depending on what it is that you're trying to do in that given point in the painting process, you have to shift and change the amount of water/paint in these 3 areas. And you need to keep paying attention to that. Now, this may seem like a lot to pay attention to because you're trying to paint. It is just so much to wrap your head around, right? Color, and then there's the brush strokes, and then, all of these things. However, if you pay attention to those 3 things in the beginning, you slowly start training yourself to the point that it becomes intuitive. You no longer have to think about it later, and that's how you develop your water control. At this point in my journey, I am doing all of these things, like removing the excess water of my paintbrush bristles by gently scraping the bristles along the top of my container, by gently tapping the bristles of my paintbrush on my absorbent towel, by adding a little bit more water into my color mixtures or more paint, and working quickly whenever I have to, etc. I do all of these things intuitively because I've practiced so many years. I promise you that these things will become more intuitive the more you paint. So remember, 3 key things to pay attention to as you're painting. Number 1, the bristles of your paintbrush. How much water and paint do you have in them already? Do you need more? Do you need less? Then how wet or damp or dry is your paper, and do you need to add more water or paint to it so that you can create the effect that you're going for? And then number 3, how watery is your color mixture on your color mixing palette? because depending on how saturated or how dry that color mixture is, or how watery that color mixture is, that color is going to look completely different. It might look extremely dark and saturated, which usually you don't want to use colors in that way in the beginning unless you're painting a very, very dark area that you have planned for. Or is it way too watery to the point that you're going to feel the need to add too many layers, which again, as I said before, the more times you go into your painting, the more layers you create, the more of a chance there is that you're gonna arrive at a flat, overworked, heavy look. So I hope that all of that makes sense. If you have that in mind moving forward in your journey with watercolor, I promise you, you're gonna move forward faster. And this is a huge tip that will help you. It doesn't matter what style of painting it is that you are trying to develop, whether it's completely abstract or representational and realistic, or what kind of subject it is that you're painting. All right, so I am going to go quiet for a bit as I continue working on these leaves because the process for these is exactly the same. All right, I'm all done with these leaves for now, and it is time to get started with painting in the berries. So I'm going to be preparing 2 different colors for myself on my color mixing palette. One of them is going to be pure permanent red light with some water in it, and the other one is going to be a mix of permanent red violet with a bit of permanent blue violet, so that I can create a nice reddish purplish color. And this is, again, in order to prepare myself and set myself up for success, so that I can have at least 2 different colors to develop different values and hues throughout those berries, so that even these secondary little details or elements in this piece have dimension in them. Right here, I'm going to swatch out these 2 colors for you so that you can see them on paper. And you can use whichever colors you have that will allow you to create your colors for the berries. All right, so I just prepared my size 2 round brush, the smallest brush that I am using for this painting process, to paint in these little elements. So I dipped my paintbrush in my container of water to make sure that those bristles are pre-moistened. And I am getting started with the lightest color of the 2 that I've prepared for myself for the berries, which is of course the red plus water. And you can see how I left little tiny highlights in those berries. And this is just paper that I left unpainted with these colors, in which that underneath background color is shining through, creating that illusion of a highlight. So essentially, I am going in and using my lightest color first, and then while that lightest color is still wet, I am dropping in my second darker color that has the blue violet in it. So I know that at least I am creating 3 different values in the berries so that I can give them more dimension and at least a bit or a sensation of a 3D spherical look. Because I have a highlight, I have I guess you could call it a mid-tone, which is the red, and then I'm developing darker values here and there in some of the berries with my red purple. Because these shapes are so small, the same idea that I was mentioning before is super, super important. Stay on top of water control. You don't want to drop in way too much water or way too much of a watery dark red color mixture or dark red purple color mixture, because that's going to easily overtake and overpower all of your lighter red. So you want to stay on top of water control for sure. You don't want your color mixtures to be super, super watery, or you don't want to go in with way too much water in your paintbrush. All right, you guys, it is time to paint in the branches, and I am creating more of this dark brown color for myself before getting started, which is my mixture of burnt sienna plus Van Dyke brown. And in this case, I'm adding even more of the Van Dyke brown in it so that I can make sure that this brown is very, very dark. And you can see me right here doing a little bit of practice work before actually painting in those very thin branches, using again my size 2 round brush. And this is something that I would highly, highly recommend doing before going in and painting your branches, because you want these brush strokes that you create to be thin, and as much as possible you want to go in with one same smooth stroke. And so many times it's just helpful to do practice drills, practice prep work, so that you can make sure that you know how the brush is going to act, and also make sure that your consistency in your color mixture is good, and it's going to help you create that single flowing stroke as much as possible. In order to do this, you want to make sure that your color mixture is nice and juicy. You want a good amount of water in it, because if you don't have enough water in it, then you're most likely then not going to run out of paint and water as you're drawing that brush stroke, and it's going to become broken, and you're going to have to recharge and pick up where you left off, and there's more of a chance of you creating a feathery line, and you don't want that. And so make sure that the consistency of your color mixture is going to help you. You definitely don't want it super watery to the point that you're laying down super, super transparent color and you can't see that branch at all, but you want enough water in it so that you can create a smooth flowing stroke. All right, so I'm almost done with these branches here. And what I'm gonna be working on now is creating a subtle illusion of veins in those leaves. So I removed all of the previous dark brown from my paintbrush bristles, and I am going in with a pretty translucent version of my pure burnt sienna. Make sure that the color that you're using to paint in the veins in these leaves, which can really vary. Sometimes you can use the red, sometimes you can use the orange color, sometimes you can use the red. It doesn't really matter. You can use whichever color you'd like, but make sure that you're going in with whichever color it is that you choose in a very, very translucent state, meaning that color mixture has plenty of water in it. You can even use your scrap piece of watercolor paper to test out the translucency of your color, and I highly recommend that before going in. And the reason why this is because if you start painting in those veins of your leaves with a very dark, saturated, dry color mixture, those veins are going to be very, very stark, very distracting, and it's not going to look very good. That might look good for certain types of illustrations, but when you want something to look more realistic and natural, it's preferable that you keep things subtle. Hint at those veins and don't feel like you have to overly describe them. The viewer is going to understand what she or he is looking at if you do it subtly. Always remember that it's always going to be easier to go in and darken than it is to go in and lighten, okay? So for me, I would rather go in super, super light and transparent. And if I find that I want to go in and darken certain sections of those lines, then I go in and darken certain sections of those lines. Another important tip to keep your veins in your leaves looking natural is to make sure that they are slightly curved and irregular. You don't want them to look very patterny or very perfect or very stiff, because that is also something that is going to take away from the natural look of these leaves. Now, as you can tell, I have a very small amount of paint left on my color mixing palette. And at this point, I'm not really adding much color at all, especially for this part of the process in which I'm painting in the veins of these leaves. A lot of it dried already because there was such a small amount of paint there. And so what I am constantly doing is dipping my paintbrush in my container of water and bringing out a little bit of water, swirling my paintbrush on top of whichever color it is that I want to reactivate. And that helps me reactivate that color. But at the same time, because there's such a small amount of color left in that well, I'm taking just a very small amount of color, which is exactly what I want. And it's exactly why I'm not constantly having to test out my color mixtures on my scrap pieces of watercolor paper before going into my painting with them. If I had more paint left on my color mixing palette and I had big puddles of paint, I would be constantly testing out these color mixtures on my scrap piece of watercolor paper before going in, because it's a lot easier to go in with way too much paint versus what you're seeing on screen right now. In my case, I have a very, very small amount of each color left on my paint mixing palette, and that is helping me. So I'm just taking a very, very small amount of this color at a time. You can see how sometimes I am going in with my burnt sienna, other times I'm going in with my red purple, other times I'm going in with my darker brown, but they're all pretty transparent color mixtures. Now, something that I am taking into account when I am painting in these veins for these leaves is the color underneath of the veins that I'm going to be painting. So if I'm going to be adding in the veins on a leaf that has overall darker colors, let's just say darker browns created with the burnt sienna and the Van Dyke brown, then I'm going to go in with my darker brown. Whereas if I have other leaves in which those underneath colors of that leaf are reds and oranges, then maybe I'm going to go in with the burnt sienna, which is my lighter reddish brown. If you have a leaf that primarily has yellows and oranges, then maybe you can go in with a orange or a red to paint in those veins. If you have leaves that are primarily red or reddish brown, you could go in with your reddish purple. This is again so that I can make sure that I'm not creating too much contrast when I am bringing together that color on the leaf and the color in the veins, because if they are very contrasting, if the color in the leaf overall is very light and the veins that you add in on top are very dark and saturated, that's going to create a greater contrast, and that is going to pull the viewer's attention to that area, and it's going to be very stark and distracting. So that's what I'm trying to stay away from. If the color underneath is lighter, go in with a lighter color for the veins. And if your colors overall throughout the leaf are darker, then you can go in with a darker brown. All right, you guys, we are officially in the very last part of this painting process. This part is 100% optional. You don't have to do it if you don't want to. If you want to leave your painting as is, then that's perfectly fine. Splattering is a super fun technique that can add texture and interest to your piece and can help bring everything together as well. It's very fun, but it's easy to go overboard, so make sure that you're coming back to look at the entire picture just to assess everything as a whole and make sure that you're not going overboard with your splattering, because it's something I've definitely done in the past. It's just a final effect that we're adding. So what I am doing right here to prepare for my splattering is I am creating more of my orange color mixture, more of my red color mixture, and I also created some of my reddish purple color mixture by mixing together my permanent red light with my permanent blue violet. When you're doing your splattering, it's super important that the consistency of your color mixtures is super juicy. You want a good amount of pigmentation in there, but also a good amount of water, because otherwise you're not going to be able to load up your paintbrush bristles as you have to do in order for that splattering to happen. So make sure that your color mixtures are nice and juicy. I would say 50% water, 50% paint in them. I am using my size 5 round brush for this, and what I am doing is once my color mixtures are ready, I am loading up my paintbrush bristles with a good amount of that color, and I am using my index finger to flick those bristles on my paper. If you're nervous about doing your splattering on your painting, then I would recommend practicing on a scrap piece of paper. It doesn't even have to be a watercolor paper, it can be anything. But practice creating a good color consistency and then loading up your paintbrush and doing your splattering. And if you have to, switch to a different paintbrush, because sometimes some paintbrushes can help you more with this technique than others. Explore different brushes, practice with different color consistencies, and make sure that your splattering is coming out nice and fine. And once you're ready, go ahead and add it into your piece. All right, you guys, that is gonna do it for today's video. I really hope that you enjoyed it and that you found it helpful. And if you did, pretty please make sure to give this video a thumbs up because it really helps support the work that I am doing here on YouTube and helps others get to know about my channel. Thank you so much for watching today. Don't forget to subscribe and click on that little bell so that you can be notified of when I share my new videos, which happens every single week. Have a beautiful rest of the day and see you soon. Bye guys!